Okay, good evening and welcome to my digital talk. Today I have a very special guest, a stellar political analyst and geoeconomic expert. This is Pippa Malmgren, and the name is probably familiar to some of you who have been listening and watching my last digital talk with her father, Harold Malmgren, when we actually covered global system transformation. Today, our focus is put on geoeconomic shifts and trends, and it's going to be a very exciting 1 hour where we will also cover all interesting signals. Pippa has actually written a book on signals. So before we start, I would like to introduce Pippa Malmgren. She is an American policy and economic analyst. She has also served as special assistant to the President of the United States, George W. Bush, for economic policy on the National Economic Council, and is a former member of the US President's Working Group on Financial Markets, a topic that is still quite relevant, and we will touch upon it. She has been the founder of several startups, really interesting companies, and currently she is in charge of also, I just found out, a very interesting drone company. So I would like to hear from her what she's currently doing. But before that, I also want to say that she has obtained her PhD from the London School of Economics, and she is currently based in London. So we will also talk about Brexit and UK, and of course, future outlook for the relations with Europe and United States. So people, probably first tell us a little bit about what you are currently doing and your current ongoing projects.
Oh, well, it's great to see you, and thank you for having me on. So, gosh, I've been doing a lot of things during COVID. It's actually been a period when I had a lot of quiet time. So I'm about to announce a new company that I'm creating. But I've been active in the drone space for quite some time, and I have a consulting business in that space. I think innovation there is happening at incredible speed. And I've been writing books the last few years about leadership. Particularly since we keep having such dramatic leadership failures, and it's an explanation as to why. But I'm starting to work on the sequel to Signals, which was all about how do you identify signals about the future that are not yet confirmed by the data. And geopolitics has always been a very strong interest of mine. And it's very interesting being in Britain at this moment, both post-Brexit and post-COVID. And I think the economy here and the geopolitics are about to become much more interesting and relevant. So we can talk about that.
Oh, absolutely. So this is indeed fascinating news regarding your current activities and the startup that you mentioned, but also regarding your most recent book projects. But you have been too modest, so I want to also use the opportunity to point to another very interesting book that I have found really interesting, which is actually Geopolitics for Investors. So I suppose that at some point you probably would also consider updating this one because investors are now discovering that there is such thing called geopolitics. And this is the reason why I actually want to put the main focus on this nexus between politics and economics, which is very much what we call geoeconomics. So geoeconomic shifts and signals and trends will be at the center of our analysis. And first, I would like to ask you to give us your assessment and also anticipation for the global economy following the COVID-19 crisis. Let me just point to the recent outlook that was published by the International Monetary Fund. Not that they are actually that they have been actually correct with their.
They've been terrible, but go ahead.
But for the matter of being factual, so that our audience also is presented with the current reports, they have actually produced quite a positive, quite an optimistic view on the global economy post-COVID-19, with percentages of growth that are astonishing given the current situation. So that is why I would like to actually hear your opinion about that. Are we going to indeed experience a sort of roaring 20s, just like a century ago, or is it more a direction towards new depression with surging food and energy prices? Certain inflationary trends are already there. So what is your take on all these macro trends and geoeconomic, so to say, outlooks?
Yes, absolutely. And I don't envy the poor folks at the IMF who have to make these projections. It's a tough job they have. But I first of all think that it's very, very important to understand that there will not be a single narrative that defines the recovery from COVID. We're going to have many, many different things happening simultaneously, even within individual countries. So in the industrialized world, I definitely see many signs of an extraordinary recovery that happens faster, stronger than anyone expected. But that doesn't mean that everybody wins. And I think that we will have many people who are going to be in an extremely difficult situation and will need the support of both the state and private organizations, which is very similar to what happened in the 1920s, because you had some people living, I've always liked to liken it to novels. You know, some people lived a life in The Great Gatsby and bought a lot of champagne and had a great time. And I absolutely see that happening again now, without any question. But you also had a lot of people who lost their footing on the world economy and slipped off and didn't find their way back maybe for 2 generations. So to say that it's one or the other is wrong. And I think that's one of the mistakes that we make both in economics and in geopolitics, is trying to predict outcomes as if they're binary. But they're not. You can have multiple scenarios occurring at the same time. I would say in emerging markets, we have an even more complex situation because of the introduction of a little bit of inflation, a bit of social unrest. And again, we could see those with assets and resources doing very well. We see record high prices for commodities, for example, and at the same time, real devastation from the lack of economic growth and the COVID shutdown. So bottom line is, you will be able to find whatever it is you're looking for. And so what matters is, what are you looking for? Now, I'm an optimist, so I believe that we've had a period of very creative destruction, as Schumpeter put it, and now we're going to be in a period of very creative creation. And I'm very optimistic that this will be like the Industrial Revolution. This will be a period of exponential growth, innovation. There's record amounts of money available and looking for a home, record wave of entrepreneurial energy. And governments are definitely throwing a huge amount of money into the mix. Digitization makes it even easier to make things work. And I'll finish with a geopolitical topic, which is the new space race is for computational power. So, you know, when we think about geopolitics through history, initially, the way you won in geopolitics is through control over land, territory. And then, 17th, 18th century, Alfred Thayer Mahan tells us it's all through sea power. And then in the last 100 years and the two world wars, it's air power that wins wars and is the domain of conflict. Today, I think we're in an era of data power, and whoever has the greatest capacity to gather it, to manipulate it, to compute it, to compress it, that's who wins. And this is why governments are spending record amounts on supercomputers, quantum computing, data collection, data manipulation, and that is the new space race. And luckily, the civilian spin-offs will be as big or bigger than the spin-offs from the NASA space race of the 60s and the 70s.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. We have to certainly unpack a little bit of what you've actually, you gave us so many ideas that I need to unpack this a little bit. Now, the first is that, do I understand correctly that a lot of energy is going to come actually from the civilian sector as compared to the previous industrial revolution, where the state was the main agency being in charge for more or less for the transformation. Now, in these technologies, and specifically regarding the trends that you've outlined, such as in space, digitalization, and so on, you will find basically a lot of civilian components, right? So startups, bottom up, also transformation. Is that correct? The way I understood it.
Well, look, governments are supporting this as well. And why? Because it's so clear that, 2/3 of the net new jobs in industrialized economies are always created by firms that employ less than 50 people. So it's the little companies that are the backbone of any kind of growth story. And they're the ones who generate most of the innovation, not big companies, little ones. Even Apple says that they're not really a big company, they're a roof. And underneath the roof, they have many, many companies of 10 people, all highly innovative. And also, let's understand that, we literally live in this era of the mobile phone, which is a supercomputer that basically permits small groups of individuals, and frankly, large ones now too, via these platforms that we're speaking on right now, to basically come together to create. And this is a very interesting phenomena. You've interviewed my dad, you mentioned Harold Malmgren, and he became quite famous early in his career for writing about the theory of the firm. Why do people come together to create organizations? So, back before the invention of the mobile phone, you had to come together in a building, in a place, and the more of you, the better. But because of a mobile phone, this is no longer the world we're in, and you can create companies without even needing to be in the same location as your co-founders. I'm doing that right now. I'm a partner of the Monaco Foundry, which is an accelerator incubator for startups, and we are having an unbelievable time finding extraordinary businesses that we're able to help and nurture and support without even being with them. It's quite extraordinary. So will this make the world economy more productive? Oh, absolutely. Definitely.
And that is also, by the way, excellent news for that parts of the world that desperately need some kind of acceleration of business, specifically, as you mentioned, emerging markets. And also, I suppose, would you agree that, for instance, some parts of the world that had to catch up with the third wave of the industrial revolution are now going to skip certain stages are going to immediately jump on the fourth one, basically trying to capitalize on the digitalization. So for instance, as you mentioned, being now in Africa, for instance, or in Latin America, or in some parts of Asia, you can actually connect yourself with other businesses. If you are in the startup domain, and use these technologies for your business. Do I understand that correctly?
Well, yeah, what's really funny is when you phrase it that way, what comes to my mind is finally the United States will start to catch up, right? It's the emerging markets who, for a long time, have had much more advanced mobile phone payment systems. In America, you still go to pay with a credit card and it has a chip and pin. They're like, oh, that's so cool. What is that, right? Everybody's still used to having a signature. So who has to catch up? It's not the Kenyans or the, folks in emerging markets in Africa. It's the middle of America that's behind. And in a way, that's kind of encouraging that we're seeing countries with little financial resources able to adopt the most sophisticated technologies. That means we should be able to do it in the industrialized world too. And that means the whole world economy will be better placed to function at a higher level.
And by the way, that brings me also to another idea, which was actually mentioned by another guest of mine during this same digital talk format, Samir Saran, who is actually based in India. And he presented this very interesting idea that there will be also new front runners, such is the case with India, where they will be actually aiming for the 5 billion market of digital products, where they do not need highly sophisticated digital products to sell on markets, as it's often the case with the so-called West, where we have actually specialized in really, in really luxury or in the high price segments, right? Even if we take all these products, for instance, so you don't need necessarily to specialize in this if you can service 5 billion markets, with very cheap but technologically well-functioning products. And I think that first of all, do you think that there is this niche now for India also as a kind of an alternative to China, given that there is this talk about global supplies reconfigurations, moving away from China, businesses moving away from China due to certain political realities in the country?
Yeah, so I definitely see global supply chains, first of all, are broken at both ends, the supply end and the demand end. The demand will come back, I believe. The supply is harder to fix for many reasons. Some of it's geopolitics, and people don't want to be buying many products from China because they're perceived to be data collecting machines. And so there's this issue that the Trump administration raised about Huawei. This is not over with. That is still a big conversation, and the Biden team have the same or a harsher view about this than ever before. And also companies are just saying, I don't want to not only risk my proprietary data, but I just don't want to wait that long for the products to come across the world. So I see the relocalization of supply chains. And I've had to make up a word for this because, people think globalization is over. And I disagree. Globalization used to mean all the jobs go to China. The new version, where you're relocalizing everywhere, is globalization at a new level. So I've called it glocalization. It's a global localization of production, which means we're going to get much more competition in the world economy, which I think is a healthy thing. China doesn't disappear, but it becomes more of its own ecosystem. And you can already see signals. I talk a lot about signals. again, being indicators of the future, but not yet confirmed by the data. So one of the signals is that when you buy a product from China, and I'll give an example, you get a little thing with the instructions, right? All the instructions are in Mandarin because they're not even bothering with English or French or German or any other language because their domestic market's so big. Why would they even care? The level of sales is too small to warrant their attention. This tells me that the Chinese manufacturers are very domestic in their orientation. And actually, is that such a bad thing? They were 100% export oriented for several decades. Now they're building their domestic market, which needs to be built with their own brands that won't travel to the rest of the world. They'll work in China, but maybe not anywhere else. Just as we have lots of brands in the West that work in the West, but they'll never work in China. So I guess my end game here is that you mentioned India. The answer is India benefits from everything I've just said. And I think investors are looking at the world now much more actively than before because the technology and, as you say, digitalization allows you to know what's going on without having to be there and see it, right? You can watch what's happening to my production line. Where are the goods moving? You no longer have to hope that the person on the ground is telling you the truth. You're actually able to just pick up your mobile phone and say, where is the product right now? Where are the shipments? What's going on? Who's doing what? This becomes incredibly powerful for raising the value of assets in faraway places, wherever that may be.
That's fascinating. And by the way, speaking of globalization, I think that it's important to stress that globalization has been here for the last 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. Since we've seen how Rome has risen to power, to global power, so the Roman Empire has been built on global connectivity. And this very same idea was taken then later by other empires and other regional powers that try to become global power. So I agree with you, and I see it in a very similar way that we are just in a cycle of the globalization right now, where you see a lot of efforts to disconnect to a certain degree due to geopolitical reasoning, but you cannot disconnect a world that has been interconnected for the last 2,000 years. However, probably the speed has been too high, and maybe the acceleration right now. I mean, a lot of political stakeholders are now noticing that they can no longer control the processes, that the unforeseen outcome of this kind of globalization speed has been namely the rise of China, and now they can no longer put this on hold, right? Mm-hmm. So where do you see Europe in this picture? I mean, Europe has been gaining from these cycles of globalization for 2,000 years, and we've seen a lot of European powers being at the top of the pyramid, right, in terms of global power projection. Right now, it doesn't look so optimistically for Europe. And then when we talk about Europe, right now we have also our own dividing lines. On the one side, we've noticed with now with the vaccination that it's no longer about Brexit. Now it's all about what you are going to hear in the European capitals on continental Europe is, why is UK doing so well? Why are they so ahead? And we've been so slow, and we've been so inefficient, and so on and so forth. And of course, on the other side, I mean, seen from the British perspective, it's a kind of a good point to be proud, and also to base your reasoning why Brexit was necessary, right? So how do you see the outlook? What is your anticipation for the macro geoeconomic outlook for Europe, and then also what are the niches for cooperation? I'm still very much convinced that UK and Europe will cooperate out of necessity, at least in some areas. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, and I was very privileged to work on the preparations for Brexit as an advisor to the government during that time. And it was so interesting how it was such an emotional issue. And I have to say, geopolitics these days is dominated by the emotional aspect of the policy issues that we face. And my feeling was, Britain would be successful either way, in or out. They'd just be different pathways. But by no means does it make any sense to say again that it's binary, it's either or. I mean, this idea that, and it's always the way it's phrased, will Britain be successful or Europe? And I'm like, listen, we've got 170 countries plus in the world, some of which are all succeeding at the same time, right? Why does it have to be one or the other? We can see two succeed with very different political and business models. And also, what's your definition of success? So, the British would measure success very differently, for example, than the French, having lived in France, right? In France, it is a sign of success that you can take a long lunch, right? That is part of what you're working so hard for. So these are cultural issues that one has to respect. And so, I think there's a reason that Britain prior to Brexit, and I believe post-Brexit, will have the most successful startup scene in all of Europe. It will have the quickest recovery from the slowdown from the COVID crisis. And why? Because it has this very entrepreneurial, not only culture, but legal and political infrastructure that really facilitates the fast movement of capital from losers to winners, from people with savings to people with ideas. Europe is not as fluid at doing that. But, having said that, as I mentioned, I'm sitting as a partner of an incubator accelerator based in Monaco, and we're seeing fabulous startups from all over Europe, really great, innovative, interesting companies. So I think maybe we shouldn't talk about this in terms of countries and borders. It's more that everywhere there are going to be some people who figure out this new landscape and make it work. And everywhere there are going to be a lot of people who don't. And that's the universal reality as opposed to any one place. And I think the same is happening from the Middle East to Africa to the middle of America. This is a moment of extraordinary transformation. And that's why, as you said at the opening, maybe I lean a little bit more on the private sector innovation, because I think government hasn't quite caught up with, what's the reality? And they're going to be wrong-footed for a while as they try to figure out how do we take back all the money we threw into the system without creating a disaster? And how do we fix the debt problem? That's where their focus is going to be. But the answer to the question is going to be all businesses created by entrepreneurs.
And speaking of such, do you think that the approach that the European Union is trying to apply, namely a very, very, or let's say quite centralized one, quite top-down approach of, pumping a lot of money into various fields and trying to support, not only revive the economy, but also support certain sectors. Do you think that this makes more sense, or wouldn't it be better to also try to revive this startups landscape also on the old continent, instead of facilitating all these huge heavy projects of trillions of euro that are very ambitious? I mean, they indeed strive for quite ambitious goals, but what is your take? Is this an efficient way of, because you said there might be several successful paths, it doesn't have to be only one. Is this a successful path for the European Union and for the European Union member states to catch up?
Yeah, I hear you. Again, I find it so difficult to talk about the EU as one entity as well. in this respect, because we're going to see very different performance from different economies. I think a country like Portugal, for example, is more likely to have a faster rebound, a more innovative approach. And that's partly because I think Greece as well, another one. Why these two? Because they got into such a mess with the debt problem and were forced to innovate. Were forced to update the rules. They ended up selling off state assets, privatizing. They, in Greece and in Portugal to a degree, defaulted on some of the debt in order to clear the pressure and the burden. And, you know, just prior to COVID, the hottest place in Western Europe for business was Athens. It was absolutely on fire right before COVID happened. And I expect that it will be on fire again with COVID lifting. And you look at countries like Italy, for example, which have not addressed the debt problem, that don't have an easy way to do that. And they're sort of stuck with this. It's like a wrecking ball of a debt burden that bears down on the economy and prevents it from being able to move forward. And this is causing political stress and strain. We see it in Germany too. It's a big contributing factor to the rise of the hard right in Western Europe, in France and Germany and Austria and the Netherlands. So when we talk about Europe and the EU, is it a uniform story? It's not. It's a completely different story, not only country by country, but again, I think this moment in history, it's much safer to think about it as even company by company or community by community. It's more granular, and there are going to be great opportunities to make money in all these places, but in very different ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that is really interesting way of looking at it, and not just this. I also think that this kind of coherent way of looking at things, always putting everything into one and the same, spot, so to say, it's not really helpful. But we will soon actually see what kind of dimension is going to present itself following the COVID-19 crisis. Now, I have a tricky question for you, which I think is really good one. Okay. As regards your signals, what you've mentioned several times, and for those who would be interested in understanding the concept of signals in a much in a better way. So it's the one question is, what are the three most important geoeconomic signals that keep you awake at night? So you have to be a little bit more negative for a second, but then I also want to ask you, what are the three main geoeconomic signals that make you smile about the future?
Yeah, I love this. Well, actually, let me phrase this where it's going to sound back to front. But one of the things that worries me is that people are too negative. And that actually the recovery is coming faster, sooner, more sharply, and people aren't ready for this. So my worry is it is going to get better and people won't catch this. So I know that's an optimism point, but it's just as dangerous from a risk perspective if people miss the upturn. But it would be typical of humans to miss the upturn. I mean, they missed the upturn after the financial crisis, right? Everybody was so sure we'll never recover. The one thing is we always recover. We always recover. So I don't think this is a repeat of the 1930s, generally speaking. But I do think there will be communities, individuals, families that come into serious hardship, and we need to pay attention to them. But it's so much easier to do that now than it was in the 1930s, when you had no data, you had no mobile phones, you had no track and trace, you had no statistics. We now, not only do we have all the information and you can see where it's happening, but the tolerance for pain is so much lower. people won't tolerate really awful treatment of members of the community. They'll demand that it gets addressed. So another thing that keeps me up at night, which is geopolitics, is this strange situation where we are already in conflict, but it's happening in places where the public can't see it. So we're in conflict already over space. And the United States, China, Russia, India to a lesser extent are all now really actively competing for who has domination over the highest altitudes in space. And why? Because you can control what happens on the planet more easily if you control the satellites and the data gathering and the weaponry space-based. So the public thinks nothing's going on. And in fact, a fortune, the record sums of money are being spent in the defense community. And it's going on two things. One is space, and the other is what I mentioned before, computational power. Also in geopolitics, the conflicts are increasingly happening in locations where there's no reporting, where the public doesn't see. So, for example, I've been for some years paying attention to China's plans to divert the water supply from the Himalayas to Western China in order to increase their agricultural and food production, which they need to do because they cannot feed the population and they need more food. But as you move the water supply, not only do you create environmental issues, but you deprive some 60 million people of water in India, Bangladesh, and that's going to definitely create geopolitical problems. Also, the huge race for control over raw materials, resources, minerals, the Chinese presence off the west coast of Africa, for example, where huge new oil and gas fields have been found. The race to control, to get control over supply chains of raw materials, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been a very powerful phenomena in geopolitics. And will that persist? Now countries are realizing they may have borrowed the money from the Chinese, like Macedonia, right? We borrowed $1 billion to build all these incredible bits of infrastructure, and now we have to pay back and we haven't got any money to do it. So how does the geopolitics play out? Kenya is another good example where that's happened as well. The Chinese built a port. Now they go, okay, we take it back because it belongs to us. And everybody's like, wait, now we have the Chinese government controlling a physical territory in Africa. So it worries me a little bit that the public thinks that nothing's going on. And in fact, we have a really significant geopolitical race for territory and for raw materials. It's just in places the public isn't paying attention to.
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose that only a very, very small minority of the people would know that China and Russia are already planning to build an international space station on the moon, which should be actually a very worrisome information. I mean, the very fact that they are planning or discussing this kind of things. I mean, think about the potential systemic coordination in the space between these forces, or as you mentioned, the case of water. I think water is going to be the oil of the 21st century. A lot of conflicts, a lot of tensions will actually emerge because of the need for access to water resources. And of course, food and energy will certainly be also part of the, of this portfolio, food, water, energy that is going to shape a lot of decisions to go, if necessary, also into military conflicts. And then you mentioned also raw materials and rare earths, and let's just take the very recent case of Afghanistan, where now once again there is the discussion of US troops withdrawal under a new US president, where I just say that under no circumstances I could imagine that US troops would leave Afghanistan, I mean, to full scale, to the full scope, in the full scope, because Afghanistan is apparently, and according to geological studies, lying on $1 trillion of US dollars rare earths and minerals that are very much needed also for for the digitalization. So everything is once again interconnected, and you notice how these classic concepts of power and realpolitik are once again back on the agenda, because these are the realities. You cannot operate without having these accesses, right? Okay, but what actually, these are the worrisome signals, but what makes you smile? What is really giving you, putting a smile on your face if you think in terms of positive signals?
Sure. Well, there's a very famous engineer called Buckminster Fuller. He invented the geodesic dome. And in the 1920s, he came up with this wonderful concept called ephemeralization. It's a very long word, but he described it as technology is changing in ways that will now be able to always do ever more with ever less. This is very much happening, where now we can create materials. Instead of needing to start with a material like a piece of wood and shape it into what you need, you can start with what is your need and shape the material. You can build it atomic structure level upward. And this change in human affairs is so profound. And so I believe this is right. Not only can you build ever more or create ever more with ever less, you do it to the point where you can actually create something out of virtually nothing. In other words, ubiquity is now absolutely a norm, whereas people still have a scarcity mindset. And that defines geopolitics. Everything we've just discussed about raw materials, food, water, territory, it's all based on the mindset that there's a finite amount and it's either mine or it's the other guy's. But actually, ephemeralization is creating a world of ubiquity where we can solve many problems, meet many needs with ever less material inputs. So I think that's super exciting. And in fact, even what we're doing right now, speaking on this platform, we are creating something with almost no resources. What does it cost to pay for a Zoom or for this system? It's nothing. So we're creating something out of nothing. And I think this is so exciting and so interesting, so empowering. I'm also really thrilled at the way technology is becoming, it's the democratization of the access to the technology. So that's happening on so many levels, from making it less and less expensive to get your hands on a mobile device that doesn't have to be an Apple. It can be something that's designed more for a poor person in an emerging market, for example. But also the democratization of access to digitization. So there's something now called GPT-3. And if the audience hasn't heard about it, they need to look at it. And what it fundamentally means is that in order to create something, normally when you think of creating something on the internet, you think about coding something, or you think about software. It's coding. Well, you need a coder to do it, right? Yeah. Someone with specialist skills. It's its own language or languages. But GPT-3 does it in English. So now we're going to have regular people who'll be able to create software and internet-based systems without needing to be a coder. Now, this won't happen overnight, but the direction of travel is clear. And this is super empowering, just ridiculously empowering. And I think that democratization is going to serve the world well.
And it's also very important as a counterbalance to the state surveillance.
Yes.
Which, of course, is now also being pushed forward thanks to thanks to the technological breakthroughs that certain states are using and capitalizing on, right?
Well, and you know, I've written a lot about surveillance capitalism and societal surveillance in this new data world. The Chinese social credit system being an example of how you control the behaviors of people in your society by having access to all their data. And it's going a bit further now with the introduction of the new Chinese DCEP, the digital currency. And I've gone so far as to describe it as a surveillance system disguised as money. And I think that's not a bad description. And by the way, this is not exclusive to the Chinese, right? We're doing the same thing in the West. We just privatize the function. So we have JP Morgan doing the test case for the introduction of sovereign digital currency in the United States, for example. And will that be a surveillance system disguised as money? Yeah, it will also. So this is the point. You're combining surveillance with underlying financial technology. And so I think a big new development is the introduction of sovereign cryptocurrencies, meaning nations introduce their own new species of money. It's not just a digitized version of the old currency. It's an actual new form of money. And we need to ask questions about what are our rights? What are the laws in this new space? Because there really aren't any, there are limited legal structures to protect the citizens in this new environment.
Mm-hmm. And also it's an interesting question how the cryptocurrencies that are right now really gaining a lot of importance, getting along with the central bank's digital currencies, because the one is a very much centralized top-down project, being facilitated by state institutions. And the other one is this democratization project coming from the people, for the people, with the people, more or less, right?
Yes.
So there is a kind of a conflict between these two, and I still think, and maybe I'm wrong on that, this would be probably the reason why cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin will not stand a chance once central banks decide to impose their digital currencies on the population, because the one cannot go, maybe not. I mean,
it's
I'm open to your
super interesting question. What's the future of the cryptocurrencies once sovereigns engage in this space? I think it's a very important question to ask, especially this moment when crypto is reaching record valuations and the real economy is beginning to accept Bitcoin payments, for example. So you can go to the grocery store practically and start to pay in Bitcoin. So the strange thing is that people thought that having cryptocurrency meant you were outside of the jurisdiction of the state. The reality is that you were always inside the jurisdiction of the state. And I don't just mean in terms of law. I also mean, at the end of the day, when you're typing in your Bitcoin password on your keyboard, what, you really think that there's no observation of we live in a world of surveillance capitalism. So I think the only person who doesn't remember your Bitcoin password will be you. Like the government knows when you're transacting in these things. You can't hide this any longer. And that's why actually it's normalizing Bitcoin and crypto, because you just declare. I'm making this much money, and then you pay your tax on that, and that's the way the game works. It's not about hiding from the system. It is part of the system. And the other thing is, when governments introduce the sovereign crypto, it's so fascinating to watch how they do it. They basically give it away. So this is what the Chinese are doing. You wake up in the morning and you pick up your mobile phone and you go, I have like $1,000 that I didn't have before. And it says in a little text message, oh, you can spend this on anything you want. Have fun. This is how people adopt it. They just given it. And eventually it becomes mainstream, normalized, and part of the normal payments process. And then what do you need Bitcoin for if this other thing does similar things? So I think it's all getting a little bit blurry. But the other thing is, look, this is all about financial innovation. And like everything else that's innovating, money is too. And this is actually very exciting to see new forms of money coming to life.
In the end, it's going to be also the question about trust, and we will find out whether trust will going to be imposed top down or whether it's going to be gained bottom up, right? So a very, very fascinating process to watch and to observe. But now I want you to go into the direction of the hardcore geopolitics. As you might guess, my next question is very much linked to the trends derived from the systemic competition and rivalry between the United States and China. What is your take? How do you see this systemic competition evolving now under Biden's administration? And also, what role do you see for United Kingdom for this very special relationship between Great Britain and United States? Now, probably UK will also take take care of some new kind of leadership where United States have neglected certain alliances or partnerships. So what is your take on that? And also, of course, do you see a role for the European powers, for the rest of Europe, so to say, in these matters?
Yeah, okay, so that's a lot to cover. First of all, the United States, it's easy to assume that President Trump was not interested in international affairs. We withdrew from international affairs, and now we're getting back involved in it again. I don't think that's an accurate picture. I think that the U.S. has been getting less and less involved in international affairs, frankly, since the George W. Bush administration. President Obama had very little interest in international affairs. That was just not his scene. That wasn't his priority. And in this presidency, the orientation is towards domestic problems. Domestic issues are the priority. So as a nation, for most of my lifetime, it has not played the leadership role the rest of the world wanted. But I say that advisedly because this is also a period of history where everyone complained that the U.S. was doing too much at a time when they were really withdrawing. And I suspect if the U.S. turned around and became active, everyone would say, this is not your business. Why are you getting involved? So maybe you can't win no matter what you do. If it's in the case of the United States, if we get engaged, everyone tells us to go home. And if we don't get engaged, they tell us to come. And so, what are you going to do, basically? What is more important is the international rules of the game, the known sort of institutional and rule structures. And they are all under pressure because they're not serving us very well, given everything's changed. So, NATO, if the thing about NATO is everyone agrees it's not working very well, but the minute you say that, then they all say, well, NATO is very important. Yes, but it's still not working very well. And it needs modernizing. It needs to needs to review the why. And ask the pointed question, why do we have tanks and troops in a particular location? is it really effective to do this in this way? If you hadn't been doing it that way already for whatever 40 years, would you really do it this way now? No, you wouldn't. So does that make you anti-international if you raise these questions, or anti-NATO? No. So this is hard. We need to have a debate about modernizing the rules and the institutions of international affairs, and expecting the US to do all the work. That isn't working and hasn't been for like the last 4 presidents. So I think there's a lot we need to discuss in the world of geopolitics that is difficult, awkward, really just hard, and nobody really wants to do it. And they're too busy doing other things.
And there is also, I see a question actually that is very much related to this current discussion. What is your take actually on the American-Russian relations? Do you see an improvement or a further deterioration? Now we've found out that Biden actually invited Putin to a bilateral meeting, a bilateral summit to discuss some important issues. There is even the speculation that it might take place in Vienna. So actually, do you think that there will be a change or shift, or like I said, maybe even further deterioration in the relations between these two countries?
Yeah. So this gets to the heart of a very interesting question, which is, are we in a new Cold War? And most people in the strategic security community will say we are not. This is not a new Cold War. And they'll list all the reasons why. But we're in a cold something. I don't know what we want to call it, but the relationships have been distinctly chilly for some time. And the typical view of American institutions, and it's always hard to say the American view because there are always multiple views at any given time, and the same on the other side, is that actually Russia under the current leadership does pose a strategic security threat to the United States. And not just in terms of, things like Ukraine, but also in terms of the nuclear arsenal. In the last 25 years, the Russians spent a lot more time and attention making sure that their nuclear arsenal was fully operational than we did in the West. And so now there's a sense of, whoa, wait a minute, how has that changed the balance of power? Another thing is that in general, the American establishment, whether on the left or the right, have a persistent view that Russia has become almost like an organized crime state. It's not a traditional superpower. It's one where private organized crime interests have greater voice, greater involvement than ever before. And that actually there's a long tradition of that in Russia, but it's come back into the mainstream. So is that view right or wrong is a different question, but I think the perception is there that this is the truth. Some people felt that, once again, President Trump left office, that these issues would somehow go away. But in fact, quite the opposite. They've intensified because the Biden team do view Russia as a strategic security threat, just as they view China as a strategic security threat. So we're in a world where the U.S. is worried about its strategic security threats rather than feeling in a more generous state of mind that, they can be made more friends and allies than opponents. It feels a lot more like a more opponent environment than I think even the public really recognize.
Mm-hmm. And I see another question coming from the audience, which is linked to emerging economies. You've mentioned it during the conversation, but maybe you can unpack it a little bit more. So there are indeed millions of people who will actually slide into serious poverty serious poverty levels following the COVID-19 pandemic. So also you mentioned with the surging inflation, I think you were the one who also pointed to the stagflation prior to the inflation during the recession cycles prior to COVID-19. So how vulnerable are these parts of the world? And is there a serious risk that this kind of, chronic poverty might also turn into a serious structural problem for the global economy? Do you think that this is something that is only, happening now for a period of time while the global economy recovers, or is it going to, be further prolonged during other structural problems in these parts of the world?
It's a great question. So, looking back on the last 50 years, we have persistently and consistently moved people out of poverty. We have lifted living standards very consistently over this period of history, and technology makes it even easier to do that all the time. So I think COVID, there's a real question about how has it hurt people. So even in the industrialized world, governments gave away so much free money, it protected the population from a much worse outcome. So did that prevent many from falling into poverty? I think it absolutely did prevent people from moving into poverty. Does that mean no one moved into poverty? No. Some people will have really been hit super hard by these events. And some nations will have been hit super hard. But what's our capacity to repair the problem? I would say better than ever in history. Better than ever in history. And again, we'll be able to do ever more with ever less to improve those situations. I also think, if you look at most parts of the world, they've become more savvy about the need to allow the private sector to do its work. You see countries like Rwanda, which were famous for terrible poverty and terrible depth of war, and now has become a tech innovation center. I mean, a major tech innovation center where, you go to Rwanda to hire coders because there are world-class coders there. This is a radical change for good. So again, I'm not so worried that the hit's been so huge that we can't recover. I actually think the opposite is that we've set the conditions now to have a more radical, faster, sharper, stronger recovery than anybody imagined. And if a country doesn't get it right, it's not because it wasn't an option, it's maybe because they made a mistake more.
It's interesting because a member of the Austrian government made a very interesting statement right at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic here in Europe, when the pandemic hit Europe and all European countries were basically hit to a great extent. So he said that this time it's about the too many to fail. So it's no longer about the too big to fail or the too central to fail, but the too many to fail. And as you pointed out, if they were left behind, so to say, it would have been probably by now a serious situation, not just in Europe or in the United States, but all over the world. So indeed, the governments interfered and introduced all these measures for the sake of the too many to fail, because they realized also that a lot was at stake at that time. Mm-hmm. But speaking of governments, and this is my final question, I'm looking all the time, I'm looking at the background, I'm looking at your book, The Infinite Leader.
My publisher makes me see it. They're like, put it up where people can see it. So
yes, that was a really good decision, because I wasn't planning to ask you about this book, particularly, but now it makes me ask you a particular question about your more recent books, The Leadership Lab and Infinite Leader. And that question is very much linked to the fact that one of the phenomena that the pandemic has exposed was the serious lack of leadership. And a lot of the consequences that we are still very much being faced with are due to the lack of such leadership. So my question to you is, what would be your recommendation? I mean, based on your work in this particular domain, I mean, having written 2 books on leadership, what would be your recommendation for the future political decision makers? How the future political decision maker should look like in terms of personal qualities and in terms of a package how to solve the problems of the 21st century.
Yeah. So I think it's more than a failure of individual leaders. It's a failure to understand that the nature of leadership has itself changed. And this will sound a little silly maybe, but the word leadership used to be about the leader, and now it's so much more about the ship. It's about the team. It's about the community. It's about the voters. And so the type of person that can command trust is very different. We used to believe that there was one person with a title at the top, whether that was president or CEO or prime minister, and that they had the greatest authority and all the answers. And we just waited for them to tell us which direction are we going. But again, in this, I keep using my mobile phone, but in an era where this is in your pocket and your ability to know and understand the true nature of a situation, or to get fake news about the non-true nature of the situation, has changed the confidence level of the public to get involved and engaged in political questions. So the way you lead has to be very different. And so one of the things that needs to happen is there can't be any difference between what you say and what you do, because everyone can see it. We're in an era of transparency. So if you say that, everybody's going to have access to the COVID vaccine, but what you do doesn't permit that, or it only goes to the elite, it doesn't go to the people more generally, everyone is going to know this. You can't hide anymore in politics. Also, the style of politics has to change, of leadership. As an example, I got asked a lot during COVID, being not only a person focused on geopolitics, but I happen to be a woman. So I was asked a lot, why is it that the female leaders are outperforming the male leaders in the response to the COVID crisis in terms of the level of trust? And I would say a lot of it had to do with style. And the female leaders like Jacinda Ardern, whose politics I don't particularly agree with, but when you watch how she announced the lockdown measures in New Zealand versus Boris Johnson, it's so striking. So Boris Johnson basically says, we're going to have a lockdown. I'm not going to tell you why. I'm the prime minister, and these are the rules, and we're enforcing them. You're just going to do it. And Jacinda Ardern says, we're going to have a lockdown. I don't have any more information than you have. We are all waiting to hear from all these scientists what's the right thing to do. So while we don't know, let's take the most cautious stance for our whole benefit as a community, not for me as prime minister to exercise power, but rather for the safety of the community as a whole. And she created not just a following in New Zealand, but a global following, right? She exercised the qualities of leadership that the modern world economy, the modern world cultural environment seem to demand. And I think that's what we're going to see in the coming decades, is the style of leadership must change because the circumstances have changed, and the old style, top down, I'm telling you what you're going to do, isn't working anymore. And bottom up, we're all in this together. I may have this title, but I'm working with you, come help me. That works better at the nation level. It works better at the company level. It works better at the community level. It works better in families as well nowadays. So this is a culture change of epic proportions.
And obviously a borderless one, which actually can be applied to any kind of state or corporation, or also community, as you said. And this is, I think, a fascinating way to conclude this conversation. I'm already looking at the clock, and I'm feeling a little bit of a little bit inconvenient, knowing that now the pubs are open finally in UK, and it's probably an extraordinary situation on Friday evening. So I'm really, really grateful for all your insights.
Thank you.
Please, to those of you who are interested in the work and in the books of Pippa Malmgren, you can go check her Twitter account, which is TRPippaM on Twitter, easily to be found, award-winning author, former presidential advisor, sense maker, great, with great insights for the future. And we very much need also a little bit more optimism. We are just too dark, too pessimistic, most of us, I would say. So follow her on Twitter, go check her webpage, which is drpippamalmgren.com, and get in touch with her. Pippa, thank you very much for being with me for more than 70 minutes. And it's been quite of a journey, really, really exciting one. And I once again learned so much from you. And I really hope that we will meet again in London. And of course, you are also very much welcome in Vienna.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Which will not be appealing to you with a huge startup scene, but it's evolving right now. It's evolving, but at least with some really interesting sightseeing monuments.
I know it well. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you for being with me.
Absolutely.